I'm sure you all know the budget legislation just came out, so this is our kind of first quick overview of what's in the budget. Our agenda is going to be to go through some of the high-level fiscal stuff, discuss some tax policy. We'll have a specific focus on unemployment insurance, which has been a very salient policy debate in this budget cycle. We'll cover Medicaid and housing, and then we'll have to leave it to a future talk to get into some additional detail on education and childcare. And with that said, the first thing that has to kind of be recognized here is that we don't have a financial plan. So even though there's budget legislation, we do not see for another month how all the numbers come together. And so in fiscal terms, that limits us to sort of what we can figure out about general trends. That said, we know that we know some high-level numbers. We know that there are federal funding risks, and so that's on everyone's minds, and that it's possible that we'll see legislators come back at some point later this year. We'll also flag some concerns that we have with this budget in terms of its preparedness for that eventuality of federal funding cuts, in particular going to tax cuts and one-time payments that are in this budget. And then we also want to draw attention to the fact that while now there's sort of two really big policy concerns on people's minds. One is ongoing issues around affordability, and the other is how to potentially respond to some of these federal risks. We think this is a budget that doesn't have a lot in the way of structural reforms that you would want to see in order to address really both of those concerns. So that's kind of the take. What we can say in terms of general budgetary trends, the all funds number that includes both state spending and federal spending in this budget is $254 billion. That's $2 billion over the executive proposal from January. So this table shows you both the all funds that includes federal spending and just the sort of state share spending that was proposed in the executive budget, in the Assembly's One House budget, in the Senate's One House budget, and in the enacted budget. And as you can see, the Assembly and Senate aim to spend considerably more than the executive, but where we ended up is a budget that looks pretty similar to the governor's budget, namely just about $2 billion over. A lot of that additional spending proposed in the One Houses was driven by proposed increases to the top tax rates on people making over $1 million a year and on corporations with profits in excess of $5 or $10 million. That created billions of additional dollars, or normally about $4 billion approximately, in terms of extra spending room for those One House budgets. And that was driven into higher increases in education funding and housing vouchers, in Medicaid rate increases and hospital funding, and in childcare workforce investments, as well as a larger expansion to the state's child tax credit, organized around a proposal called the Working Families Tax Credit that would both increase the amount of money and make some additional reforms. So what you see in terms of the way it all shook out is that a lot of those legislative proposals didn't really end up in the final budget, or to the extent they did, they were sort of very small versions, say, of what was proposed by the legislature. Lastly, one of the things that originated in One House budget was the proposal to pay off the unemployment insurance trust debt, which Emily is going to go into detail about, but that came up first in the Assembly, and then it was sort of a last-minute negotiated item that just came out at the end of this past week. So other points that are or that do merit just sort of a brief mention. As I said, we'll have a sort of later discussion of some of the childcare and ed stuff in detail, but there's been increasing concern about the extent to which past expansions of childcare eligibility are now underfunded, especially in New York City. And so there's an additional $350 million investment for New York City childcare subsidies, And there's also something that's likely to be an ongoing debate about changes to the main education funding formula, foundation aid, where essentially there's going to be a bit of rebalancing that will result in New York City getting a bit less money than it would have under different versions of the formula. And in both of the legislative one houses, certain technical changes were made so that that wouldn't happen, but those changes did not end up in the enacted budget. That's kind of all the detail we'll go into on that issue here. But I think important things to flag in terms of comparing what's been at issue in this whole cycle with where we ended up. And one more point on childcare is that there's, in addition to childcare subsidy funding, there's been a real interest in funding childcare workforce investment, and that came up in both of the one houses, but didn't make it into the final budget. So now you take this $254 billion enacted budget, and how do you think of that in terms of fiscal trends? Some critics have said that sort of budget growth is out of control and that it's unsustainable. And it's true that we've had actually significant budget growth over the past few years as compared to basically the 2010s, where budget growth was very constrained under basically an arbitrary spending cap that FPI had always been quite critical of. And the bulk of this growth is concentrated in Medicaid spending. However, we think that the best way to frame out budgetary growth is not really in dollars or even in inflation-adjusted dollars, but as a share of overall economic activity, because that basically tells you about the state's capacity to fund public sector spending and investment through tax receipts. And what you can see is that that decade of spending constraint really brought the budget to a historic low in terms of its size relative to overall state economic activity. And the increases that we've had over the last few years have actually brought it up to regain a little less than half of that lost ground. So there is real growth, but we think it's both stable in terms of the revenue that we've seen, and it's like at a sustainable level in relation to the state economy, here measured as a share of total personal income. This just breaks out where the different program growth, and so you can see that we've had some modest inflation-adjusted growth in education, really resulting from finally phasing in the sort of what had been for a long time scheduled increases in realizing that full level of foundation aid funding, and then a meaningful rise in the health and mental hygiene line, which Michael can talk about more. The other things to know about our current fiscal outlook are that we actually had a very strong end-of-year revenue result. So the most recent forecasts that the state did were in January, and they projected that total tax receipts for the year, or really tax and other receipts, would be just over $142 billion, and we ended up with just over $148 billion in total receipts. So that's just a few months after that forecast was done, the state really had an extra $6 billion. That is, and before they got that $6 billion boost, they had expected a $3.5 billion surplus for the end of this fiscal year, which ended in March. And they were forecasting a $1.8 billion surplus for the fiscal year that we're now in, fiscal 26. So we're currently seeing very strong tax receipts, and I'll talk a little bit about how that functions with reserves. And that contrasts with the state's forecasts for the future budgetary years, starting in 2027 through 2029, where they project budget gaps. And so that always provokes some concern about the sustainability of spending. But given that our current revenues are strong and actually coming in stronger than forecasted, we think generally there's a picture of actually a fairly strong fiscal outlook, setting aside some of the federal funding concerns. We think those forecasted budget gaps are generally driven by kind of bearish revenue projections, with the exception that there are tax cuts in this budget and in this financial plan that do drive some out-year concerns. Reserves are always important, but it's particularly important right now because we're thinking about how to manage federal funding risks. And there's a question about what to do with these surpluses and whether they're going into reserve and whether reserves are being drawn down. There's actually a surprising lack of clarity here that we won't really understand until we get that financial plan. We basically ended the year with about $34 billion in reserve, which is a very substantial reserve. They're going to spend $2 billion of the current year surplus on the inflation refund because it got pared down a little bit. And then there's a big question about how this all interacts with paying down the unemployment insurance debt. And I'm not going to go into details on the mechanics, but that's going to be a $7 to $8 billion expense, and we'll either see it bring down reserves or we'll see a different kind of budgetary mechanic where they could use this end of year surplus to pay down that UI debt and then sort of keep reserves at a stable level. Often end of year surpluses sort of disappear in the sense that they're used to prepay future expenses. So you don't see them increasing reserves in the state's account. Rather, they manifest as reducing future year expenses. In normal years, that would be kind of a technical distinction, but today it becomes very important because it raises the question of how much in reserve the state has that it can use to, say, bridge federal funding gaps. And so speaking of federal funding, the reality of this risk is we've got about $91 billion budgeted in federal funds for this year's budget. So that all funds number of 254 billion includes about 91 billion in federal funds. And that's overwhelmingly concentrated in health. We get federal funding for things like certain disability benefits and public schools and transportation infrastructure, but 74 billion of the 91 billion is in Medicaid and other health spending. And if you've been following the federal fight, you know that there's a very serious focus by congressional Republicans on finding ways to cut Medicaid funding to states. So that's where the risks are concentrated. And nobody really knows what level of funding cuts we could see, but it could be on the order of $10 billion as a kind of ballpark estimate. But it's pretty much up to Congress right now. This budget does include a measure to address that risk, but it's not the sort of measure that we would like to see. We think the best way to go about this is basically to plan to use reserves and potentially raise revenue in the event that we lose serious federal funding, because the social and economic consequences of people getting kicked off Medicaid or cutting funding to hospitals can be quite serious. Instead, what we see in this budget is a power granted to the budget director to withhold appropriated payments in the event of technically a general fund imbalance of over $2 billion. So that means if there's some sort of shortfall, whether it's caused by a recession or loss of federal funding, whatever the case may be, and the state ends up with a $2 billion shortfall, the budget director, really meaning the executive branch, gets to decide how to withhold funding. They give the legislature 10 days to propose an alternative and adopt it by concurrent resolution. But if they don't, or if the budget director doesn't approve of their plan, then the executive plan goes into effect. And there's no limit on the amount of money. So if we lose $10 billion and the legislature doesn't sort of respond as prescribed in the budget legislation, then you get this executive plan to withhold. And so that, again, sort of leaves a big open question as to whether we would see, even if we would see a special session, or how it would be approached later in the year once we start to see federal funding losses. Shifting gears a bit, just to the state side of the budget, there was a fair bit of tax policy this year. The governor started off the budget season with a so-called affordability agenda, much of which we were quite critical of because it basically consisted of checks in the form of this inflation refund and an income tax cut. There were some good things. The child tax credit expansion is widely supported by policy experts, and making school meals finally universal was a great decision. To cash out some of the affordability effects, we just charted how valuable that is. And this really shows you this chart that, the tax cut is pretty minimal. The inflation rebate is pretty minimal in terms of the medium-term 5-year benefit. Conversely, free school meals and the child tax credit end up to be over $5,000 or up to $10,000 over the course of that period. And so when you compare it to inflationary increases in the cost of housing and the cost of childcare, about half of this agenda makes sense. Half of it is kind of expensive and not that meaningful, but it all ended up in the budget. In particular, the tax cut is probably our biggest concern because it has the kind of worst ratio of cost to benefit. The budget does cut taxes for every household, for households making up to $323,000 if it's a married taxpayer. The cost of this is $1 billion a year. It's permanent, and that'll rise over time. But they did delay it, so it actually phases in half in 2026 and half in 2027. The benefit of that depends a lot on your tax bracket. So if an average household in New York making $80,000 to $100,000 sees about a $15 a month benefit from that tax cut. If you're upper middle class, if you're sort of towards the upper end of that range, then it translates into $500 to $600 a year. Still probably not that meaningful. We would say definitely not worth it given the fiscal risks of losing another $1 billion at this time. One issue that has not gotten enough attention is that in addition to the income tax cut, there's also a planned corporate tax cut that will cost another $1 billion a year. Our current corporate tax rate is temporary and it expires in 2026. So that means in 2027, there will automatically be a corporate tax rate cut. And while the budget right now, is for this next fiscal year, and so in a sense, we have another year to adjust that corporate tax rate. Because of the way they do financial planning, that $1 billion per year revenue loss from the corporate tax cut does show up in the financial plans. So when they look at future budget gaps and revenue expectations, that incorporates this assumption that they're cutting corporate taxes. On the flip side, they extended our current taxes on high earners, but didn't make them permanent. So those are extremely important. We have higher tax rates on people who make over $1 million a year. They were set to expire in 2027. They raise about $3.6 billion a year. And if those aren't made permanent eventually, then you're looking at pretty serious cuts to services. Additionally, they did deal with funding the MTA capital plan through something that was widely opposed by the legislature, the payroll mobility tax. This is an employer-side payroll tax that applies just downstate in the MTA region. They split it into 2 districts. New York City is one district, Long Island and Hudson Valley is another district, and they sort of split the rates. So they lowered the rates a bit for businesses with smaller payrolls, and they raised it on businesses with larger payrolls over $2.5 million, but there's still a significant discrepancy between the New York City area rate and the Long Island and Hudson Valley rate. It used to all be the same, and then about 2 years ago, they split it up just to raise taxes on New York City. We've always been very critical of that because it kind of underestimates the extent to which the regional economy depends on properly funding the MTA. But the proposal also requires the MTA to trim $3 billion out of its spending plans, which you think is probably unwise. The governor framed that as the MTA making a sacrifice, right? But the MTA it's not a taxpayer. It doesn't make sacrifices. That just means we get less MTA. So it's kind of peculiar. It really wasn't necessary to put this all on the payroll mobility tax as well. Often this debate gets framed as like, which tax are we going to raise or what thing are we going to do? But the MTA is already funded by a mix of 4 or 5 different dedicated taxes, including the corporate tax. So they really could have at least paired it with other more progressive tax increases to get to the same funding bottom line. And with that, I'll pass it over to Emily, who will talk about one of the biggest sort of most important issues from this session of unemployment insurance.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. And I hope you all can hear me. Let me know if you cannot. So I'm going to talk about unemployment insurance. And as Nathan said, this was one of the areas that actually I suppose we saw the maybe most positive change amongst policy areas. So I want to sort of remind everyone sort of where New York's unemployment insurance program sort of has been over the past few years. There's three major shortcomings as we see it. One is that the benefits paid to people who are unemployed are far too low. They're set currently at 50% of your sort of previous wage in the past year. But there's a maximum benefit, and that maximum benefit since 2019 has been fixed at $504 per week, which if you multiply that out, that's equivalent to $26,000 a year, which is technically a poverty wage. So one major shortcoming is that the benefits are too low, and that operates both through sort of the rate and the maximum benefit you can receive. The second major shortcoming is that many workers are excluded from the scope of the program's coverage. That's been discussed a lot among progressive advocates and really needs a lot of attention. And then the third in New York in particular is that the program in New York is chronically underfunded. It's technically been underfunded since the mid 1970s. And so it needs tax reform to increase how much revenue it brings in. So with all of those sort of fundamental shortcomings, to set the stage this year, going into this year, there's a $6.2 billion debt with the federal government that the New York State incurred during the COVID-19 recession, when we had to pay out way more in unemployment insurance than the state had the ability to pay out. So we took on a $10 billion debt. We still have over $6 billion in debt. And when we have that $6 billion in debt, that forces a freeze of the maximum benefit level. So that's why we had the maximum benefits frozen at $504 per week since 2019. Can you go to the next slide, Nathan? Okay, so this budget did a couple of things. First of all, actually at the bottom of the slide, you can see basically the budget made a deal between business and labor, and ultimately that deal resulted in paying off this $6 billion in UI debt that we have with the federal government, which allows that benefit to unfreeze. And as part of the deal, labor insisted and that in the statute, the benefit be increased to the level it should have been at in 2025. So it's now written into law that the maximum benefit for an unemployed worker is $869 per week. And that is equivalent to roughly $45,000 a year. So it's a really significant change for workers in terms of what their weekly benefits are while unemployed. There's very little change to who's included in the scope of the program, unfortunately. There is a small change to the taxable wage base, which we expect to raise about $450 million per year. Just to demonstrate sort of the visually how big a change this is in terms of the maximum benefit. So in 2019 and in the years since 2019, the maximum benefit has been frozen at $504 per week. That's less than the maximum benefit in Texas, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts. Now, the change that has been made and legislated or written into law is will push the maximum benefit to $869 per week. And so now we're much more in line with peer states, as we should be. And potentially we could say that's still not enough, but I think it's at least a big positive change. This is just another way of depicting it. We should have been on that yellow line, the yellow dashed line, this whole time between 2019 and 2024. Instead, we were on the flat purple line with benefits not increasing because we had this outstanding debt with the federal government. We estimate at FPI that workers lost $9 billion in total sort of benefits over those 5 years. And so there's nothing to sort of remedy the fact that workers lost $9 billion, but now we're pushing the benefit, the weekly benefit, maximum weekly benefit up to where it should have been in 2025. Okay, so FPI's policy priorities for the unemployment insurance program in New York. We did want the state to pay off UI debt as soon as possible. In an ideal world, we would have had businesses probably face a surtax to pay it off. Instead, the state appears to be planning to spend out of reserves to pay this off. But honestly, the fact that they're paying it off expediently is what allows us to increase the benefit back to where it should have been. So we applaud that effort. As I have already said, the maximum benefit level will now be restored to its 2025 level at $869 per week. There's a small change in the taxable wage base that we project will raise $450 million per year. But that I gave that a yellow check mark because more work needs to be done on the taxable wage base, and we need to increase it significantly more than they did in this budget. So the remaining priorities are: we need greater expansion of the taxable wage base, as I just said. We need to increase the overall benefit rate to be a higher share of previous wages. And we need to expand UI to cover workers who are currently not covered by the program. I'll say a bit more about that. So the unemployment bridge program has been proposed for a couple of years now, and it proposes extending UI coverage to self-employed workers, cash economy workers, people who are currently in reentry, and undocumented workers. There's also a proposal to extend UI to education workers who lose their employment during summer months when school's not in session. So these are like custodial staff or cafeteria staff. That's been sort of proposed and discussed in negotiations recently, but hasn't yet been adopted. In green at the bottom here, I'll just note there is included in the final budget a shortening of how much time a striking worker basically a striking worker will only need to strike for 1 week, and after 1 week is entitled to UI benefits, according to the final budget. So that's also a small win for workers. Okay, just to summarize, the executive budget, just so you know, had only proposed paying $165 million just to sort of pay the interest on that total $6+ billion of debt. But there's been a big change between the executive budget and the final budget because this deal was struck between labor and business that returns the UI fund to solvency, which involves paying over $6 billion to the federal government. That does result in some tax relief to businesses. And it also makes possible this increase in the maximum benefit that workers receive when they are unemployed. And then, as I mentioned previously, there is a small change to the taxable wage base, which we project will raise $450 million annually. We're going to skip education and childcare and come back to that next week or the week after because we're missing our key colleague who works on that. And I'll pass it to Michael for healthcare.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Emily. And there are a lot of great questions in the chat. We will, I think, be sharing around the slide deck, and we'll try to take questions at the end as we roll through. My name is Michael Kanukin. I'm the Health Policy Director at FPI, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the enacted budget does in Medicaid spending. I'm going to talk about some broader challenges in Medicaid spending, and then finally, the federal elephant in the room and how that might impact this budget deal. So the executive budget, as proposed back in January, sort of it made the argument, the governor made the argument that Medicaid spending was really out of control, but then didn't do much to actually control Medicaid spending. The executive budget reported state share Medicaid growth of 17%. There are a number of accounting issues with that. And if you really look at sort of comprehensively state and federal spending on Medicaid, under the executive proposal, it was only projected to grow by 3.7%. The state share of Medicaid spending is growing a bit faster because as pandemic assistance sort of gradually flows out of the system, the state is taking up more of the burden of paying for Medicaid. Generally, the enacted is pretty close to the executive, just slightly more generous to providers, provides some safety net funding, which we'll get to. But I would say, without a financial plan, it's hard to say exactly, but I would say all funds Medicaid spending is up about 4% under the enacted. So next slide. So this is Medicaid spending over the last several years by source of funds. I include this graph mostly to just say, the spending growth ticked up quite a bit after 2020, and that spending growth has moderated. What is growing a little bit faster is, again, the state share. Next slide. And you can see why that is. This is the federal share of New York State Medicaid spending. You can see it spikes way up in fiscal 21, almost to 70%, and then has been sort of trending down ever since. And so this is what's driving state share Medicaid growth, is sort of the accounting split between state and federal share. Next slide. So in terms of where that money is actually going, we have, the executive budget did an MCO tax, provider tax, which provides, a short-term increase in federal revenue, frankly, kind of exploits a loophole in the existing regulations. Everyone understood when this was sort of, the state decided to do this last year, that it was short-term revenue. That revenue is mostly being spent on provider rate increases. The executive called for really significant increases to hospitals and nursing homes. The one house budget, sort of, the legislature came back and said, let's do that, but way more, right? Like twice as much. And the final numbers appear to be pretty close to what the executive did. So substantial increases for nursing homes and hospitals, increases, which, I'm often skeptical of increases for those providers. Really good to see increases for the physician Medicaid fee schedule. Medicaid pays too little to physicians, and it creates a network access issue. And then also to federally qualified health centers, which provide safety net care. One sort of just open question that we'll be tracking in the next couple of weeks is that the executive called for, and the enacted did a $125 million state share hospital quality pool. I haven't been able to find much public information about that, and I find whenever something in New York State Medicaid policy has the term, either the term quality or the term stability in it, the details often are very interesting and confusing. So we'll be tracking that. Another achievement for the hospital industry was the medical and indemnity fund continued. This is a state subsidy that lowers the cost of malpractice insurance, essentially, for hospitals, and it's an ongoing debate. So that continued to be funded. Next slide. And then this budget continued sort of an ongoing state debate about how to address the needs of safety net hospitals. Coming out of the pandemic, many hospitals, about a third of the hospitals in the state, have found themselves in pretty significant financial difficulty. This is driven by a number of sort of short-term and long-term trends. The shift to outpatient care, continuing sort of significant gaps between the commercial insurance rate paid to providers and Medicaid. And so this graph is from the executive, is sort of showing how many hospitals are financially distressed, and then all the different pools of money. you can see that the executive proposed a significant drop-off in safety net funding in fiscal 26. That was driven largely by a $500 million cut to the VAPAP program. This is Vital Access Provider Assistance Program. It's short-term state grants to really distressed hospitals. The enacted restored that $500 million, which was probably the biggest single change in the healthcare budget from the executive. And so, you know, I think the state has a long-term question about how it wants to handle these hospitals with, you know, the thing we would recommend is for the state to provide more stable long-term funding for them. And I think other experts are more interested in hospital closure and consolidation. I think that's that ball is still in the air, and it's kept in the air by sort of extending VAPAP from year to year without providing any long-term stability. Next slide. The safety net, in other sort of safety net hospital news, the safety net transformation program, which is operating in capital support for hospitals in financial distress to sort of restructure, which can mean service cuts and whatever, continued to be funded with $300 million in operating funds and another $1 billion in capital funds. A really important issue for New York City is the health and hospitals funding line. So the state, the executive proposed cutting the health and hospitals allocation from the indigent care pool. This looked like a cut, but it's actually not so bad because it allows health and hospitals to get a different source of safety net funding, the directed payment template funding, which could actually leave H&H with more money than it was getting from the indigent care pool. So that's sort of the plan. Unfortunately, the risk is that DPT payments require federal approval, and the federal government hates us and no one works there anymore. And so it may be that that DPT funding won't be approved for H&H. Advocates asked that the budget contain a provision that basically says if we can't get DPT, they keep their ICP funding. That was not in the final budget, and that sets up a dynamic where the Trump administration could refuse to approve DPT, and that would put us in a really create a major budget hole for H&H. So that's an issue to watch carefully. Next slide. One of the sort of strange things about following the Medicaid budget is, right, there are all these decisions, spending decisions that that show up in the state budget to allocate provider rate increases or grant funding or whatever. But what actually drives the bulk of spending is program dynamics, right? Like how many people enroll in Medicaid, and especially what mix of people enroll in Medicaid. So folks who need long-term care, even though they represent a small share of enrollees, they're very high need. And so they wind up accounting for almost half of total Medicaid spending. And so in terms of the long-term spending growth, the question of like how you manage the programs that treat those very high need populations winds up being actually more important than the various provider rate increases and so forth. And this budget reflects a real continued failure of the Hochul administration to sort of manage and address the basic problems in the managed long-term care program. Essentially, you know, in 2011, the Cuomo administration implemented managed long-term care as a mandatory service with the idea that insurance companies would be able to manage home care delivery better than the state government can. That has never really worked. It's never been effective. And so it has left the state in the position of doing a series of sort of blunt instrument program changes and eligibility cuts to attempt to manage this program that really is just a cash cow for the insurance companies running it. It's been really disappointing to see. The latest that's been in the news is the Hochul administration moved the CDPAP program, which is half of New York State home care enrollment and spending, to a single FI, and the idea being that the single FI would be less expensive, and so that would save the state money. Unfortunately, they hired an incompetent vendor and really bungled the rollout in a way that has both created a lot of service disruption, a lot of challenges for enrollees, but also caused many enrollees to say, well, CDPAP isn't the right model of home care for me. I'm going to move to agency care, which is another sort of corner of the home care market that's actually more expensive. It's dominated by for-profit providers at this point. It's very hard to regulate. And so it's just very disappointing to see the Hochul administration, in the name of trying to save money, actually implement a policy in such a way that it will probably lead to a net increase in Medicaid spending while also disrupting care for hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers. That gets to next slide. That gets to the sort of broader point that we can't keep managing the most important, the most expensive, but also the most vital for people's lives aspect of our Medicaid program through a managed long-term care program that everyone sort of agrees is not working as intended. A proposal that was live in the budget debate last year to just sort of eliminate MLTC and move back to fee-for-service. Some analysts claimed it could have saved $3 billion a year. Our view is that's the right direction. But regardless, I mean, the root problem here is that if New York State should be very proud of running a very large, very generous home care program that really keeps people in their homes, avoids nursing homes, and takes the burden of care off of working families and sort of socializes it. That's all really good. It's also expensive, and the scheme we've attempted in the past 10 years of having it run through for-profit insurance companies has really failed. We need to step back and do reform from the ground up there. So that's a disappointment. Another disappointment in the budget is the continued failure of the state to address private sector healthcare cost growth. Private sector healthcare costs are growing faster than Medicaid. They're a huge burden on employers and individuals. You've probably seen it in your own insurance deductibles. There's a really good proposal sponsored by Liz Krueger, the Fair Pricing Act, to try to constrain one element of that cost growth, the growth in hospital costs. We were disappointed to see that not in the budget, and we hope to see it passed, in the remainder of session. But more broadly, I think there's a sort of excessive focus on Medicaid cost growth and a lack of focus on the broader question of cost containment. So, and then next slide. Obviously, in some sense, the whole healthcare budget of the state is provisional because it relies on $60 billion in federal funding, and there are a lot of threats to that funding. I want to just really briefly talk about what those threats look like at this moment. We all probably know that the House Republicans have committed to a really large cut to Medicaid nationwide, $880 billion over the next 10 years, which is like a 10% cut to federal spending on the program. They have really struggled to make progress on that proposal, fundamentally because Medicaid cuts are incredibly, incredibly unpopular. And so the status of the negotiations right now is that they've taken off the table some of the things that would have been the worst and scariest just for New York in particular. Cuts to the federal match, block granting, per capita caps. And so what's still on the table is work requirements, reform to sort of state Medicaid financing mechanisms like provider taxes, crackdowns on immigrant coverage, and then waste, fraud, and abuse. Keep an eye on that last one, because fundamentally, the work requirements and crackdowns on immigrants don't save a lot of money, because most people on Medicaid already work, because the federal government doesn't provide much funding for immigrant coverage. And so there's a real question of sort of what they're planning to do under the heading of waste, fraud, and abuse, given it's going to be really challenging for them to meet their cut targets under that heading, unless by waste, fraud, and abuse they mean it's just a backdoor to do more general cuts. There are also a lot of concerns, federal budget aside, about potential executive action, cutting federal funding to New York's 1115 waiver. A nightmare scenario is that they could withdraw, sort of retroactively withdraw approval of the MCO tax that funds a lot of our Medicaid budget this year, and then federal disapproval of state-directed payments would be a big issue for New York State safety net providers. So what the Medicaid budget I described may wind up looking really different in 3 months if the legislature comes back in session in the context of federal cuts. And I think that's it for me. Yeah.
Sorry, my thing was muted. Okay, so I'm going back to housing. And I see that it's 1:20, so I'm gonna move fast. Seems like we always move fast on housing, which maybe someday we'll allocate enough time for it. Okay, I think most of you are in the loop, but just to remind you, in the fiscal year 2024 budget, which was 2 years ago now, the governor did propose a pretty bold set of legislation that was called the Housing Compact. It had major land use reforms, including transit-oriented development and local production mandates, and it was rejected by the legislature, mainly coming from the New York City suburbs. Last year, they did reach a deal on housing that was touted as a landmark housing deal, but we estimate falls far short of being sort of good enough to solve the immense housing needs of the state that you are all well aware of. So, but last year they renewed production tax incentives. They did establish good cause eviction in New York City, and other localities can opt in. And there was some modest land use reform. And then in city politics in the New York City area, or in New York City specifically, we adopted City of Yes, which should also increase housing supply over the next 10 years somewhat. But there seems to be little appetite for additional bold and sufficient land use reform. Next slide. And then sort of echoing all of what we've been talking about with federal funding risks, it does appear that there will be some major cuts to housing funding potentially in the near future. So I actually haven't been clear on Section 9 funding, but Section 9 funding I've always thought is like some of the most at risk federally, because it goes more to blue states like New York, and I don't think the federal government currently likes blue states. And NYCHA in particular receives over $1 billion in operating support from the federal government, and an additional roughly $1 billion a year in capital funds from the federal government. And NYCHA is in deep need of capital investment, both to increase the amount of units that are available to people and to bring them up to safety standards, so that the residents have heat and aren't getting sick from mold or lead poisoning. So Section 9 funding is very at risk federally. The Section 8 funding from the federal government, it's been reported, is also on the chopping block, and New York City alone receives over $2 billion in federal government support for Section 8 housing. The low-income housing tax credit, I'm not currently sure what's going on with that, but in the last Trump administration, there were major reductions in low-income housing tax credits, and the value of low-income housing tax credits is also majorly affected when corporate taxes are cut. So the value of the tax credit itself is threatened. There's also some block grant funding from the federal government, but it's relatively small. Okay, so this budget so far has not done anything in the way of land use or zoning reform. There has been discussion of these two pieces of legislation and proposals. The first being a reform to the state's Environmental Quality Review Act that would streamline the environmental review process for multifamily affordable developments. The executive actually proposed this in January, but it limits the reform to housing that's less than 10,000 square feet, and that's a very big limitation. That probably limits it to, housing that's like 4 or 5 units, and we would really like to see that be apply to bigger multifamily units, multifamily developments as well. That wasn't in the final budget, but it is being pushed in the legislative process. So we'll see what happens with that. And same with faith-based affordable housing, which would probably allow for the production of something like 60 to 80,000 new units across the state. It makes it possible for worship communities to build affordable housing on their land. It wasn't included in the final budget, but it is being pushed in the remainder of the legislative cycle. Public investment in housing. So there was a revolving loan fund proposal that basically would give low interest rate loans to mixed income housing development projects. The executive budget proposed $50 million as the sort of seed funding for that loan. The final budget has $100 million for it, $50 million for projects outside of New York City, and then $50 million for New York City. But this is a carve out of the City of Yes fund, so it's not really like new funding in the overall budget. It's just like basically earmarking 50 million of the already existing. I should have put it here, but $1.025 billion of funding that's put into the City of Yes plan. There has been a lot of pushes to add funding to the NYCHA and to other Section 9 public housing around the state. The executive proposal only included $25 million for NYCHA, again, as part of the City of Yes funding. The final budget includes $225 million for NYCHA as part of City of Yes. So again, it's not really an increase in overall funding. It's just earmarking some of that City of Yes funding for NYCHA, which is good for NYCHA, but it's sort of takes funding away from other housing priorities in the city. There's also an additional $75 million for public housing authorities outside of New York City. And then there's $60 million in the final budget for Mitchell-Lama preservation, $30 million for New York City, and $30 million for outside of New York City. There's $100 million set for to be given to localities as part of the Pro Housing Communities program. That's in grants. And then there is, I guess I put the Mitchell-Lama piece twice. Finally, this was unexpected because it wasn't part of either the governor's proposals. I guess it was part of the One Houses, but it wasn't expected to be in the final budget. But there has been established a housing access voucher program pilot funded at $50 million this year. That's been, a demand by housing advocacy groups for a long time. So it's good to see it, but it's a lot smaller than what has been requested. So yes, we would recommend that, first of all, we expect NYCHA and other sort of public housing funding to be cut significantly by the federal government. So the state and the city need to start committing more funding to keep that housing afloat. There was a proposal to reduce the barriers for localities to have to implement rental regulations, that hasn't been picked up yet. And then FPI is in support of broader land use reform that would increase the supply of housing in the state, including transit-oriented development, housing production requirements, and the couple of proposals I mentioned earlier, the faith-based affordable housing, seeker reform, and there are many others that we can get into at another time. So that is it. And I think we have time to answer questions.
Yeah, we could take a few more questions. We bumped up right to 1:30, and there were a lot of questions in the chat that we typed out answers to. But if you want to have another question or raise your hand. Potentially answer a few more.
Nathan, you see that someone's asking about childcare and
yeah, we our childcare and education expert is just out right now. So we expect to publish some analysis next week and probably have a supplementary briefing next week or the week after. But if you have specific questions, just reach out and we're happy to discuss live. You know, one thing that I wonder if anybody here knows about. So in the Ben Walcott asks about the sort of payment withholding provision where if we have a general fund imbalance, the budget director can just sort of, the governor really through the budget director can unilaterally make cuts. It's really structured to give the governor very broad powers. Because the legislature only has 10 days to propose an alternative plan and the budget director can overrule it. But one thing that is not clear to me, and I think is not explicitly clarified in the legislation, is the legislature it says the legislature can pass concurrent resolutions with their alternative plan, but not more than that. I'm not really sure what happens then. If anybody here is super familiar with those details, we'd appreciate your input because it's not obvious on the face of the legislative text. I'm not seeing more questions and we're at time. Oh, all right. Question on Medicaid global cap. That's a Michael question.
Sorry. Yeah, Laura, that's correct. I mean, my general take on Medicaid global cap issues is that the global cap is a piece of political theater. Like it is very common for the executive to do cash management, typically by moving money back and forth between the health budget and the mental hygiene budget in order to either stay within the global cap if we're above trend or make it look like we're just below the global cap if we're below trend. And so, you know, there is room to manage, but there sort of always has been, if that makes sense.
All right. I'm not sure that we know the answer to the question about the All Electric Building Act. So I think that's it. Thanks for joining us. Hope this was helpful. As always, if you have questions, comments, or things you want to add, feel free to reach out. Our emails are just last name @Fiscal Policy. You can also reach out to info@fiscalpolicy.org. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.